Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for another interview of Magnifying Our Impact. And today I'm with a very special gentleman who I actually met for the first time last year and is one of these people that, and I'm really excited to get into the psychology of Felix, this gentleman we're interviewing this morning, because he has a fascinating background and has a really inspirational story, particularly for young entrepreneurs, young leaders around the world. And there's many people that have dreams and aspirations and hopes as to the difference that they want to make in this world. But Felix is one of a number of people that at a very young age had the foresight and the courage to actually take action and to create an opportunity to really help the world, to eradicate the difficulties with regards to climate change and environmental sustainability, and to really move us on and be a spokesperson, not just for the youth, but for leaders around the world as to how we can really repair some of the damage or a lot of the damage that we've done so far over the last 30, 40, 50 years. So, Felix, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us. And, you know, it's great to talk to you, Felix, because your backstory, your last 10, 11 years for you has, I'm sure, has been an amazing experience. But you've had you've had an amazing first 21 years on this planet, or is it 22 years now?
22, yeah.
22 years now. Okay, so you've had an amazing 22 years so far on the planet. And so what would be, I think, really great, Felix, is if you can do two things, first of all, for us. First of all, start wherever you want, obviously, but give us an indication of where you feel your journey started, and just tell us about your past and where this all started for you and how you've grown and developed over the last 10 years, and then share with us a little bit about where you are and what you're doing now.
Sure. So I grew up in a small Bavarian village about an hour outside of Munich. And when I was 9 years old, I was in fourth grade. My teacher at that time asked me to give a little talk in my class about climate change. This was in 2007, after that warm winter. And I guess she slightly, confused weather and climate. And because of that, she chose to create a unit about climate change early that year. So I was to give that talk, and the weekend before I started preparing it. And while doing that, I found out about a woman from Kenya called Wangari Maathai. And she later received a Nobel Peace Prize, and she did a huge range of wonderful things. But most famously, she started a women's tree planting movement in the 1970s. And in the course of 30 years, her movement ended up planting 30 million trees. With women all across Kenya and some other East African countries. And what's incredibly impressive about her work is that she essentially used tree planting as a tool for women's empowerment, because she paid these women small amounts of money that they would plant trees. And for many of the women that joined her movement, this was the first independent income of from their families. And at the same time, she obviously tackled environmental degradation in Kenya. So it's a deeply inspiring work. But I was 9 years old. I didn't understand the depth of her work. I only understood really that tree planting helps reduce climate change. So this is why I, at the end of that talk, told my classmates that we children and youth should start planting trees. And my classmates loved the idea. So we set ourselves this, I guess, I can only say ridiculous goal of planting 1 million trees in each country of the world. And the obvious first step was to plant our first tree. So a few weeks later, we planted that first tree. And I think this is where we were incredibly lucky, because two local journalists came that day and reported about our first tree. And that's how some other local schools found out about our work and started planting some trees as well. And this is how Plant-for-the-Planet initially spread. And I say we were lucky because I don't think we had any real plan of what we would do next. So it was great that these schools joined in. And then we met a slightly older student who created a very simple website for us. And this website was essentially just a ranking among local schools of who had planted the most trees. And lots of schools wanted to outcompete their neighboring schools and by planting more trees. And this is essentially how Plant-for-the-Planet spread. And after 1 year, we had planted about 50,000 trees. And after 3 years, 1 million. And more children and youth joined in over time and joined from countries all across the globe. So what we then essentially started doing is organizing Plant-for-the-Planet Academies. These are essentially one-day workshops in which we train our young members how they can be effective leaders on climate change. They obviously learn how to plant trees, but that's just one small part of it. A big part of it is learning how easy it is at the end of the day to give a presentation and to stand up in front of your peers, in front of adults, to talk about climate change and the importance of action and so on, so that all of these young people can be our ambassadors and spread our message. So over those years, we've now empowered 90,000 children and youth at these academies in 74 countries to become our ambassadors that way. So that is the bulk of our work. And what we've also been doing in these past 13 years, maybe one of the things I'm most proud of, is spread the vision of the 1 trillion trees. When we started achieving our goal of planting 1 million trees in each country of the world, we really started asking ourselves, what is the next goal? Where do we go from here? And I guess we had 2 big questions in that process. The one big question was, how many trees even exist globally? And there was no real answer to this. Some ecologists had tried figuring it out a long time ago, but there were no real conclusive answers. And the second big question was, how many additional trees could we plant? And also for that question, no real reliable data, until we found a great team of scientists that set up a lab at ETH in Zurich and did several years of research on these 2 questions. And they came to 2 important answers. First of all, there are roughly 3 trillion trees on Earth right now. 3 trillion sounds like a huge number, but the tragic part of this is that we used to have about 6 trillion trees globally. We used to have about twice as many trees as we have today, but we humans cut them down in the course of the last 11,000 years, but of course mainly in the last few hundred years. So that's the first important part of what they figured out. And the second, maybe even more important part, is that in addition to the 3 trillion trees that currently exist on Earth, we have space to restore about 1 additional trillion trees. So we can't go back to these 6 trillion trees very simply because we need some space for agriculture and settlements and so on. But we could plant another trillion. We can get roughly from 3 to 4 trillion. And if we manage to plant these trees, they would be one of the most powerful ways to tackle the climate crisis. Very simply because these trees capture the CO2 that we emit. So it's been our mission to convince the world to plant these trees. And, we started calling for this in 2011. Back then we were, on our own. Nobody really took us seriously. But, since we've been advocating for it, the idea has started to spread. Some other NGOs like the WWF got on board calling for it as well. Some political leaders have called for it. And by now it's this list of political leaders calling for it actually include the U.S. president as well, who at his State of the Union address early in 2020, called for 1 trillion trees to be planted globally. That's obviously maybe not the ideal ally for a project like that, but it is still impressive to see how this idea that we came up with 11 years ago or 9 years ago actually has spread so widely and has caught on. But so far it's only an idea and very little is happening in terms of implementation. So we're not just talking about tree planting, we're also planting trees ourselves. We have our members planting trees all around the world. But importantly, we also have a slightly bigger tree planting project on the Yucatan Peninsula in southern Mexico, where there's about 20,000 hectares of destroyed forest. Just to give you a sense of scale, that's about the size of the District of Columbia. And we took charge of these 20,000 hectares of forest and are currently in the process of restoring that forest. So we have 100 employees there on that site, planting on average one tree every 15 seconds. So that adds up to a bit over 2 million trees every year that we plant there to still slowly restore that forest. So that's the rough overview of what we do at Plant-for-the-Planet. Of course, it's not me; it's a big team of people that are making all of this happen. We've got about 140 staff members around the world, and of course a huge host of volunteers active around the world. And I'm personally also currently working on my PhD in ecology.
Fantastic. That's quite a story. And so, Felix, I'd love to, first of all, ask you about your psychology. Because, when you were young, well, compared to most of us, you're young now, but when you were, unfortunately for us, but when you were very young and you were a kid, looking back there, what do you feel was your psychology that said, this must happen? This has to happen. I have to create action. I have to plant a tree. Now I have to plant 1,000 trees. Now I have to plant 1,000,000 trees. Now I have to plant 1,000,000,000,000 trees. So I know it comes from you. I'm sure it comes from an element of your parents, your sisters, your family, your ancestors. But talk to me about what is your mindset? What do you tell yourself? And where did all of this come from, this psychology about creating this level, this size of action?
It's very hard for me to say. This is like a long time ago, and I certainly wasn't that reflective at no. 9. But what was certainly very important for me at the time was that my favorite animal was the polar bear. It had been my favorite animal since my aunt had given me like a huge polar bear when I was, I think, 5 or something. Polar bear at the time was bigger than I was, and it slept in my bed every night, and became my favorite animal. And as part of that project in 2007, preparing that school presentation, I learned that this was the heyday of climate change communication through polar bears, right? And that was my main motivation back there, saving the polar bear. And I think my first talk I ever gave in that classroom was how to save the polar bear. I think that's what it was called. So that was the main motivating factor back then. And I think it's also incredibly important is that at that point I had no conception of what this, would mean in my life.
Sure.
I was just, a 9-year-old, planting a few trees with my classmates.
Sure.
I would have never expected. It took me a really long time until I realized that this might be a longer journey I was setting out on.
And when you look at yourself now, when things get tough, or when you're working really hard and you think to yourself, I'm overloaded, or we've got to do this, we've got to do that, or wow, I've got a big thesis to write for next week, and also I've got to be in this meeting, and I've got to go, and talk to these people. Or as human beings, we all have an element of fear. Talk to me about your psychology now that you're 22, about what still motivates you today. What's the psychology? What do you tell yourself to keep on going?
I think we're really lucky in planting, trees in the broad sense for a very simple reason. It's how easy it is to measure our impact.
Yes.
And, for a lot of work that other people do, it's much, much harder to tell at the end of the month whether you've, made progress.
Yes.
And the beauty of trees is that it's very easy to count them.
Yes.
And at the end of every month, we know we have, 200,000 more trees in our project site than we had at the beginning of the month.
Yes.
And that's incredibly motivating. Of course, I think what's also important part of the story is that Plant-for-the-Planet has evolved a lot since the early days. at the beginning, we were just the children's in youth project, or just children really planting trees in schools, running a simple website. That was what Plant-for-the-Planet was for a very long time. And, as I described at the beginning of our conversation, it has evolved with so many other elements. And now a huge part of our focus is this professional tree planting, and is supporting scientific research in ecology, that kind of stuff. And so I guess the reason that this has continued to attract my interest, or why I've remained motivated, is because we were always able to evolve it. And when we understood the importance of new aspects of our work, we were willing to, evolve our organization in that way.
For me, my experience is there's two biggest things that really impact our performance and our action on the planet. One is who we spend time with, and one is the experiences that we have, how we learn and develop. So just share with me, what do you think of I'm guessing Wangari Maathai might be in here, but what are the three biggest experiences that you've had in your life that have shaped your vision?
Certainly learning about Wangari Maathai, and then actually getting to meet her very briefly a few years later was incredibly wonderful. I think I was like 11 or something when I got to meet her, and she had been such an important part of my life for 4 years at that point. So this was incredible, although she very sadly passed away from cancer a few months after we met. That was hugely important. Another moment that really shaped how I viewed the world happened a few years later. And this was, not sure exactly what year. This might have been 2012. I was maybe 13, and I was invited to give a talk at a conference with CEOs of many of the biggest chocolate companies in the world. And that day, we saw this as a huge opportunity for us at Plant-for-the-Planet, having such an important audience, an opportunity to do real fundraising there. So I gave a 30-minute talk about Plant-for-the-Planet, and at the end called on these companies to support us. And I suggested that each company should give 0.1%. 0.1%, I think, of their turnover. Actually, the exact call we had, that they should donate one tree, so €1 for each ton of chocolate they produce. So that's what we announced back then. But not a single company there wanted to support us, which was hugely disappointing for us, because we had really prepared that day for a long time. And then one of our ambassadors said, then let's make our own chocolate. Let's show them. And, we of course laughed at that at first, but, it sounded like a fun project. And we soon managed to find a chocolate company willing to work with us on this. And 6 months, literally just 6 months after that talk, our first bars of chocolate were delivered to the first supermarkets. And we sell several million bars of chocolates every year. And they provide a substantial amount of the funding for our tree planting. And aside from, Plant-for-the-Planet in general, this was, I think, the moment where I realized how, easy it can be to launch something, to do something, to have a change like that. With just a small team of people that were enthusiastic and were having fun. I think that was a big defining moment for me as well.
Felix, I have a belief that everybody is uniquely special on the planet. There's nearly 8.8 billion of us that walk the planet, and we all have skills, we all have unique talents. And sometimes those talents are realized, and sometimes, unfortunately, they're not. I'm interested, and I know I keep digging for this, and I'm fascinated by it, is you have a way, with lots of other people that you've surrounded yourself with, you have a way where you found the ability to create big action and stand in front of CEOs when you're 13 years of age and to speak, you've spoken and you've convinced, what we class as world leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And much as you and your sisters and your father and your mum are very humble people, you've created impact with people who've got massive reach in the world. So there's lots of people listening to this interview that are also leaders and running charities and everything else. And there's also, I'm sure, young people that want to create their vision and create action. So just talk to me a little bit about how do you feel about creating action? And were you frightened at first? How do you feel about getting out there in the world? I'm trying to dig into your psychology about what you think about. Do you see the world from a planetary perspective? Do you just see it as one person at a time to convince them? How does your psychology work about creating action? And do you care who's in front of you? Just talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think my journey was a little unusual in the sense that it started at a weirdly young age, and because of that, I never had the chance to worry about all these things that other people worry about.
Yes.
Because
you just got on with it.
Yeah, exactly. At 9 or 10, you don't really have that
fear.
Often don't have that fear. Often don't really have that understanding of who these people are. I mean, once you've seen a politician on TV for 10 years, then they can seem scary. But if you found out who they were on the car right there, it's a very different moment. And for instance, if I were to speak at the UN General Assembly today instead of 7 years ago, 10 years ago, whenever it was, I would be truly mortified. And back then, it was still intimidating, but far less so than it would have been today. So I think, I think that explains a lot of it. And I mean, like, once you've noticed that it's not that hard, it's not like you get nervous later on. Yeah. No, I am still nervous ahead of each talk and so on. But yeah, I mean, we would have never predicted that Plant-for-the-Planet evolved in the way it has, and I would have never expected that the U.S. president would, or this U.S. president would once express our message of the trillion trees in that way. And I don't think I would have asked for it if someone had this talked to us about this beforehand. So this was a big moment for me, realizing how wide these ideas have spread, and about the true responsibility we have in that context, with always making sure that we express those ideas in the best way possible. Because of course our message is very clear, that we need to plant as many trees as possible, while at the same time drastically reducing our global carbon emissions. Our only way of managing to tackle the climate crisis in the long run is if we drastically reduce carbon emissions. But that is not going to be enough. We, at the same time, we need to restore the global ecosystems. That's our message. Of course, what the US president said is he took over our number of the trillion trees, while at the same time leaving the Paris Climate Accords, right? Which, does contradict our message. So we have to be very clear, and we're now being especially clear that, of course, tree planting alone is not going to solve that challenge.
When you look at your ability to be able to influence other people, and you started young, and of course, you're absolutely right. When we're kids, we have this courage and this inspiration, and providing we're healthy, we just go through things and we see it as all as fun and amazing adventure. And then sometimes, unfortunately, there's a psychology in which some people start to lower their standards or look at the fears or don't develop as much. But in essence, what would be your message for all of your colleagues and friends at the university, or lots of 14, 16, 18-year-olds or 28-year-olds that are sitting there thinking, I should do something, but I don't know what to do, or I know what to do and I'm not doing it? So if I was to give you a minute or two to give some guidance as to what you'd love your friends or your colleagues or the world to do right now, to take action, what would your biggest piece of advice be?
That's a very challenging question. And I think what I want to say is that, maybe this sounds like I'm, endlessly optimistic and believe in my ability or, our ability to change things. But that's not entirely true. For these past 13 years, one of our biggest missions, or one of our core missions, was to mobilize young people, especially through our academies, to campaign on climate change. So that young people can force governments to do more. So I've been trying this for 13 years, and we've have a lot of fantastic youth giving talks in their local community.
Yes.
Something. It never felt like we had achieved anything at a meaningful scale in that way. And then, of course, so I had kind of not lost hope altogether, but lowered my expectations drastically. What young people could achieve. And then, of course, Fridays for Future came along 1.5 years ago, and they had the same general idea, mobilizing youth for climate action, but did this, of course, in a much better way. And hit it out of the park, and had a tremendous impact in some countries in galvanizing public understanding of how dramatic this crisis is, and how quickly we need to act. And I'm still awed by the scale of these protests and how many young people they managed to mobilize. So that was, I guess, to come back to your earlier question. Important moment in my life in realizing that something that I'd actually lost hope about, like a central thing within Plant-for-the-Planet, but hadn't truly realized that I'd lost hope in that way. And I think that is certainly comes with age as well. I think that you put your own goals in perspective and kind of internally lowered those expectations that you had. So it was fantastic to see that happen again. And of course, this was successful because it was started by a young woman with such incredibly deep conviction that she did what she did without any expectation that it would become anything larger than herself.
Yes.
And this is why I'm so deeply awed by her.
Yes.
And of course, by the entire movement that developed around her.
Yes, absolutely. So where do you believe this deep conviction comes from in people, Felix? Are you born with it? Do we learn it? Where does it come from? Deep conviction.
That's a good question, and I don't know if I'm not sure if I'm the right person to ask about this.
No, I don't. It's just interesting to hear, because I suppose there's two places. For me, there's two places that can come from. Either we're born with it, or that we get it from our environment, right? And we learn about it. And I suppose it's both. I'm just interested because, your father's an amazing man, and your mum, I've met your mum as well. And, behind every great man in that way, your mum's amazing. And I've met your sisters, and you as a family, from the time that I've spent with you guys, are a really strong family. And so it might come from that. It might come from the fact that we're born with it. It might come from people we meet, or all of it, probably a bit of all of it.
Yeah, I think you're certainly right. I've certainly learned a huge amount from my parents. And I think most importantly, what my father deeply believes and lives is a total unwillingness to conform with rules, and a lack of belief in limits to what in regards to what humans are allowed to do and supposed to do and can do. And I think I was incredibly lucky to grow up in a family in which starting a tree planting movement isn't absurd, but
absolutely.
something that somehow seems like a totally legit thing someone could do.
Yeah.
And that was certainly an important experience in my life.
So I know that so far in this interview, I've asked you a lot about what's happened so far and what's happening now. I'm, of course, very interested in your views of the future. So talk to me a little bit more about what your vision is for you, for your life, and for the future of your work. What would you like to do next, and what would you like to see happen? What's your vision and your purpose going forward, Felix?
So we need to increase global forest cover by a third. That's a huge mission we have ahead of us. And the biggest challenge in implementing this is vastly scaling up the amount of funding available to restoration. And I think my biggest mission over the next decade, and in many ways, is to somehow mobilize those large forms of funding, be it from governments, from companies, from wealthy individuals that support landscape restoration. So that is the broad theme. The way we're going to do this is, obviously lots of different projects involved there, but that's the big mission. That's really what we need to achieve, while at the same time, of course, tackling the climate crisis more broadly.
And how much each and every day, how much time do you spend, how many hours a day do you spend thinking about the planet, and how much time do you spend thinking about your lunch or your call at 2:00 or what you have to do on this piece of research or your PhD? So how much time do you spend thinking about the forests and the world around you, thinking about it, and how much about you yourself as Felix?
That's a really interesting question. I certainly often think that I don't spend enough time to think about strategy, about planning, and that broader conception, a broader approach. But I've actually found starting my research very rewarding in that regard, because it kind of forces you to think a bit more broadly and to think outside of your organizational structures, right? Because of course, what we need to do at Plant-for-the-Planet all the time is figure out new ways to increase donation volume, increase of funding. You've got your staffing issues, you've got all these kinds of things, and it kind of distracts you from thinking more broadly and thinking more long term, and thinking about the world's ecology in general. So I found the research to be wonderful in that regard.
When you look at your teams, and I've met a large number of your team, at least in Germany. What's your sense of culture within your organization? In other words, what do you think's created this really strong bond between everybody in the office? What do you think's created this culture? Did you just find these people with a real inspiration to plant trees? Obviously, they had it within them, but I think you guys have created a wonderful culture of really lovely people who work really hard, who have a shared vision. Did you just find those people, or did they come wanting to work in something that was good for the planet? And the culture, they've come into a culture, did it develop organically, or is it something that you guys are focused on?
I think the fact that we're working on something that is so evidently important as restoring ecosystems and planting trees means that it's very easy to find people who are passionate about it too. Okay. And there's no one who works at Plant for the Planet who's not incredibly passionate about finding the best ways to address the climate crisis,
No.
and passionate about nature. So, that's a huge advantage we have over Shell, for instance, right? Where I think a lot less people are passionate about the mission of the entire organization. And of course, what's really exciting for me right now is that more and more of these early members of Plant for the Planet are now at an age where they're graduating from university looking for jobs. Yes. So we've been in the last few years hiring the first early members of Plant for the Planet, people that have been part of our movement for 10 years,
so cool.
And now starting full time. And of course, these are wonderful people to work with because they know exactly what we are all about from day one. They have very strong feelings about how we can improve the organization, of course, because they've seen everything for 10 years and have ideas what needs to be done. And, we have such strong personal relationships that makes it wonderful.
I have two more questions for you. I have lots of questions, but I'm conscious of our time. I have two more questions for you. One is, when you look at I don't know what it is now, but say it's 7.8 billion of us on the planet. I think I might be close. I'm not sure exactly how many people are on the planet right now. When you look at all these billions of people, how do you feel about the human race right now, Felix?
I think we're facing truly difficult challenges at a global scale that we are in no way equipped to adequately address at the moment, because our government institutions in general, obviously function at a national scale. So in the best of times, this would be an incredibly difficult challenge. And of course, a lot of our major influential governments are abdicating their responsibility and focusing on other issues. And was also really makes me a bit pessimistic is that it seems climate change can only ever be at the top of our global political agenda, or even at a national political agenda, when literally nothing else is going on. Right? So we've been doing this since 13 years, and there was a slight interest in at international level in climate change in 2007. Then the financial crisis came, the European economic crisis, and then the refugee crisis. So in all of these much more short-term problems that dominate the political agenda, topics like climate change are then suppressed. This past year, 2019, was the first time that we saw in many countries that climate change actually managed to rise to the top of the agenda. And this was simply because nothing else was going on, or nothing major was going on in these countries. In countries where something else was happening, like Brexit in the UK, or the US government, that wasn't the fact. And this makes me really pessimistic, because we're essentially just sitting there waiting for this little window that's entirely unpredictable, so we can finally make this a topic again and then have some incremental progress. So that's that makes me a little pessimistic.
And I think you've done this extremely well during the interview, but if there was, my final question, if there was one piece of advice or one thought that you have, or wish or a dream, or one piece of advice that you'd love to give to people out there, what would it be?
Well, the simplest thing, as a very easy mission for anyone, is to reduce meat consumption. Eating meat is one of the biggest contributors to climate change, causes a huge amount of the deforestation globally. And meat consumption used to be so hard because you had to accept, that there are a lot of things you can no longer eat. But with the improvement of plant-based meats that has happened in the last few years with companies like Beyond Food and Impossible Burgers and a lot of very quick young competitors emerging now as well. It's really a much smaller step than it used to be, and the trade-offs you're accepting in your life are really small now compared to the huge impact. So I feel like we are very close to a tipping point where we're starting to run out of excuses for not doing it. So that's my call to action, I guess.
Yeah, great. Felix, it's been amazing talking to you, and thank you so much for your time. It's really inspiring what you've done over the last 13 years and what Plant for the Planet continues to do, and I'm super excited to be a part of your organization and also follow your journey and Plant for the Planet's journey over the coming years. I think you're a real inspiration, my friend. It's been great talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Craig. And I hope we'll see each other again very soon.
We will. Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Wonderful. Goodbye.